Thank you, ma'am. As I was jotting my questions down, I realized that every one of them just about involved perverse incentives. And I think one of the problems in this whole area is that our whole structure of how we pay for and obtain energy was created 100 years ago, and there are the incentives go in the wrong direction. The incentive is on the utility to build things. That's how they get paid, a rate of return. The more capital you invest, the higher your rate of return for your shareholders. So we need to be thinking about how to maintain those businesses and a reasonable return for their investors, but at the same time change the incentives so that there's an incentive to do renewables. Here's an example. The payback on weatherization is enormous. I mean, particularly in northern climate states. And Mr. Grunow, here's an idea. In my experience, one of the barriers to weatherization is the capital cost to the homeowner. And even though the return may be 100% or 40% or some very high number, they don't have the cash to make that investment. I've heard of cases where the utilities themselves become the bank and lend the money to the homeowner to do the retrofit, and it's paid back through the utility bill. And it relieves this whole financing question, and it's a sort of neat way. Do you have some thoughts about that, or how else can we incent these kinds of projects?
Well, for one, I think that's a great idea. We had our previous governor of Alaska, Governor Bill Walker, signed an on-bill financing technique like you're talking about. It hasn't yet been set up, but it's what people need is a mechanism to be able to afford these things, right? If they're going to afford it themselves. And so I'm just going to say, yeah, that's a great idea. You know, another thing too is if we could, people don't know. People just don't know what they need to do to make their house more energy efficient or whatever. So, and it goes back to the education piece.
Well, let me make a suggestion there.
Sure.
We now have enormous capacity to process and utilize data cheaply in a house. The Prius effect. If you know what your house is using for energy and what different decisions make, and you can see it, the theory is that Prius drivers get about 10% additional mileage just because they can see what's happening on that little screen. If you hear about me hitting an abutment, it's because I was watching the screen and not the road. This would be, you know, a simple, like a thermostat, only it would be data. Here's what you're using. Here's what you're using for heat. Here's what you're using for electricity. I commend that to you. Another problem with incentives is the utility opposition to distributed energy. Because if you put solar panels on your roof and don't use as much energy, then the utility loses revenue. And, you know, we've got to figure out how to change those incentives. Another one is that we haven't talked about today, I don't think. In many places now, the cost of transmission and distribution exceeds the cost of the energy. And that's a significant cost driver in the whole energy picture. Again, but the incentive on the utilities generally is build more transmission, because that's how you, and they're not bad people, they're just doing what the market tells them to do. But we need more incentives for a more efficient use of the grid, time of day pricing, so that you use power when it's cheap at night. You can flow more kilowatt hours, for example, to charge a car, which will lower the cost of distribution and transmission because you have more kilowatt hours upon which to use that fixed base of the cost of the transmission. They don't have to build any new wires in order to do that. So, Mr. Simmons, is that something that you guys are looking at? I mean, the grid is one of the most inefficient animals on Earth. It's like a church built for Christmas and Easter, and all the pews are empty in the middle of April. You see what I mean? We've built this capacity for the hottest day in August, and it's got to be there. But most other days, and particularly in the middle of the night in the winter, you don't need all that capacity. So evening out the utilization of the grid would be a much more efficient use of that fixed cost asset.
Well, and this is also one of the things that I'm talking about when I talk about greater flexibility in the grid overall. As in, one of the way to deal with flexible generation is to have more flexible consumption. As in, for buildings to be able to respond to, to increases or really to respond to what the prices
market
are in the
signals.
grid.
Yeah.
And buildings need to have better communication technologies. It's also very helpful for those buildings to be more energy efficient overall, so that the buildings are seen as a resource for the grid. That this
And
is
electric
this is a
cars
real
would
effort.
also
Todd.
be the same.
And
I mean, it's a distributed storage capacity.
exactly, over 70% of electricity is consumed in buildings, and at times of peak demand, it's over 80%. So there is a real opportunity, but we need better communication technologies as well as insulation sensors, and that is a large percentage of the work that our Building Technology Office is currently doing.
Just two other quick suggestions, Dr. Keller. Enormous potential in offshore wind, gigantic potential, higher capacity factor, higher efficiencies, fewer environmental questions. That's got to be on our thought. I mean, on both coasts, we happen to be a country that has a lot of demand on our coast, and of course, storage. Storage is the whole deal in terms of integration of renewables. And I agree with you. I don't necessarily think lithium batteries are the long-term answer, but if we can crack economic storage, then solar, then there's no barrier to solar and wind. And hydro, as Senator Heinrich, can be used. If you've got storage in hydro, that could be the battery. That's what Norway and Denmark are doing right now, is swapping power back and forth. Wind in Denmark, stored hydro in Norway. So I hope that's high on your agenda.
So, Senator King, I couldn't agree more with you, absolutely. And let me just throw something in there. How you described the grid, you made the perfect case why a lot of utilities looking into their kind of business plans for the future. So there's a lot of changes coming along, very similar how you described that there's a lot of new business opportunities, just how Dan described.
But we have to provide them with an incentive to chase those instead of opposing them.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is I don't know if it's necessarily an incentive or if it's the way we structure some of our oversights on the grid. I think this will change over the next years, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you.